black man with locks, and a watch, beads, and a very low-cut beard. I'm about 6'1". The Association of Writers and Writing Programs is a small but mighty nonprofit organization that amplifies the voices of writers and the academic programs and organizations that serve them. And while championing diversity and excellence in creative writing, I am a member of AWP's board of directors, but first and foremost, I am a member of AWP. Membership with AWP provides me with the writing resources year-round, but just as importantly, it allows me to support other writers, especially those who are just starting out. My membership dues help writers find meaningful careers and publication opportunities and make services like the Writer-to-Writer Mentorship Program and the AWP HBCU Fellowship Program possible. If you aren't already, I invite you to become a member today. We're delighted to bring you this event today, and I'd like to acknowledge and thank all of our conference sponsors and literary partner for hosting this event, and in this case, it's Sarabande Books. Our literary partners and sponsors allow AWP to present these extraordinary literary events and help us keep our conference affordable and accessible. Please join me in thanking to all of our conference sponsors and partners for their support and participation. So before we start, a few brief housekeeping. Please silence your cell phones. Remember, there's no flash photography allowed during the presentation. Respect seats marked as reserved for attendees with accessible needs. And please give the authors about 10 minutes after the presentation to get to the book signing table before approaching them to have your book signed, which I believe is going to happen right outside these doors here. Lastly, we ask that you be aware of your fellow attendees who have disabilities and help AWP be more accessible. Specifically, if you see a barrier to accessibility, let us know by calling or texting our accessibility hotline at 248-269-6635. I will say that again. You can call or text 248-269-6635. Please also be aware of those with invisible disabilities and do not question someone's use of an accommodation. Thank you, and it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome, I'm going to introduce Kaveh Akbar, who's going to be moderating this panel, who will introduce and give more information about this fantastic event. So, Kaveh Akbar.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to AWP. You guys have probably been here for a minute. My name's Kaveh Akbar. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much, Kenyatta. Thank you to the translator, too, for reminding us that language is material and for demonstrating the creative act of translation. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you guys for coming out. We're here to celebrate this new anthology out from Sarabande called Another Last Call, Poems on Addiction and Deliverance. I'm like looking up at the screen as if I'm going to find the name written there. I guess I will once I say it, which is interesting. I edited it with my spouse, transcendent American poet Paige Lewis, whose bio I'll read in 1 second because I don't want to. So let me read the bios of everyone assembled here that you may quiver in awe as I do when I behold them. My name is Kaveh Akbar. I told you that. My pronouns are he, him. I'm glad to be here. This is Paige Lewis. They are the author of the poetry collection Space Struck from Sarabande Books. Lewis co-created and curated the YouTube channel Ars Poetica with author John Green. Lewis's poems have appeared in Poetry, American Poetry Review, Plowshares, and elsewhere. They teach at the University of Iowa and in the Low Residency Program at Randolph College. Our next friend is friend of the content of the book and contributor. That's the word that you say for friend of the content of the book. Is contributor, transcendent American scholar, editor, poet, Joy Priest. Yeah! So I'm not giving you very clear clap cues, for which I apologize. I'll settle in. Joy Priest is the author of Horsepower, out from Pitt Poetry Series in 2020, winner of the Donald Hall Prize for Poetry, and the editor of Once a City Said, a Louisville Poets Anthology, out from Sarabande. Her honors include an NEA Fellowship, a Fine Arts Work Center Fellowship, and the Stanley Kunitz Memorial Prize from the American Poetry Review. She is an assistant professor of African American and African diasporic poetry in the MFA writing program at the University of Pittsburgh, and the curator of community programs and praxis at the Center for African American Poetry and Poetics. Round of applause for Joy Priest. Also a big fan of the presently beleaguered Golden State Warriors, which she'd be happy to address questions about. Sure, still, I think presently beleaguered is still safe. And last but certainly not least is contributor Thomas Q. Morin, the author of the collection of poems Machete and the memoir Let Me Count the Ways, as well as other poetry collections Patient Zero and A Larger Country. And you might, how public is the other stuff? Am I allowed to like nod towards it? You might keep your eyes peeled for a little novel in the works. You might keep your eyes peeled for a little bit of, he's one of us now. He's the co-editor with Marie L'Esperance of the anthology Coming Close, 40 Essays on Philip Levine, and translator of The Heights of Machu Picchu by Pablo Neruda. He is the recipient of fellowships from the Civitella Ranieri Foundation, the NEA, and the Guggenheim Foundation. He teaches at Rice University and the Vermont College of Fine Arts. So round of applause for all of our contributors. So I can speak a little bit to my relationship to the content. I am a person in recovery that has the texture of intimacy when I say it to a room, but it's like actually one of the least intimate things. It's like there are a few things, if you Google my name, there are a few things that would come up more quickly than the fact that I'm in recovery, which is a funny way to be in the world. But I've been in recovery for 10 and a half years, so this anthology, which you should all buy 12 copies of, and give it, it's a good stocking stuffer. What's coming up? Easter? It's a good Easter egg stuffer. I don't know your people's holidays. But yeah, it's a follow-up to an anthology called Last Call that was really, really important to me in early sobriety. I carried it around. I was like, wow, it's possible to make poems out of this experience or through this experience. When I was a kid, I always would, when I was sad, I wanted to listen to sad music, right? I wanted to listen to music that would, and that kind of always confused me. I was like, wow, am I inherently masochistic? Am I inherently like just wanting to stick my thumb in the wound? And it wasn't until later in life that I recognized that when I was sad, I wanted to hear other people say, I was sad too, and I lived to sing about it, right? It wasn't a masochism, it was a sense that they had made it through and that they were making art, right? And so if they were making that sort of art, then it might be possible for me to do the same. And so I carried that anthology around like a tome, like the skull of a saint, just really, really. And when Paige and I, transcendent American poet Paige Lewis and I first started a courtin', I remember I was like, you gotta read this. It'll tell you everything you need to know about me. It's better than like any OkCupid profile, or and they did, and I think it really helped them to understand, my perspective. So, yeah, it's an anthology that meant a lot to me, and it is one of the great privileges of my creative life to have gotten to be a small bit of wind at the back of this one. I really, really love it, and I'm so grateful to Sarabande for giving us the opportunity to edit it together, too, as it was such a sort of bedrock tentpole of our bedrock tentpole is a very mixed metaphor, but of our early relationship and our early courtship, and it really built a foundation upon which we could talk to each other and use the same language. As Paige, as a civilian, doesn't have the problem where if they drink they burst into flames, and so just it means a lot to me to have gotten to be a part of this. Thank you so much for it. I'm just gonna read. We did not put our own poems in here. Not that there's anything wrong with that editorially. It's just not a practice that so on and so forth. I don't know why I'm like, this sounds now like I'm being snarky. I'm not. I actually don't. I'm going to read a couple poems that I really like from the anthology. This is a poem by Martina Spada. It's called The Cannon on the Hood of My Father's Car. Oh, and I should say, too, the anthology is very much organized around the experience of addiction. The experience of addiction is one that often affects the people who love the addict a lot more aversely than the addict themselves. You know, when I was in active addiction, I was very much just kind of lurching from crisis to crisis. You know, I was not really aware of the harm that I was causing. I wasn't super aware of my neglectfulnesses, but the people around me were certainly aware of it. The people who loved me were certainly aware that I had shattered my pelvis or, you know, whatever the thing was, right? The people around me were abundantly aware. And so we curated this anthology with that in mind. We curated the experiences of people who love addicts as well, right? Because they are so dramatically affected by this disease in a way that is fairly unique, right? The people who love someone who's suffering from, well, you know, it's different if your loved one has diabetes or if your loved one has, I don't mean to be, whatever. It's just, it is aversely effective in a kind of unique way. So some of those experiences are represented here too. So again, this is Martina Spada's The Cannon on the Hood of My Father's Car. The football coach taught driver's ed. He would hear a siren pass and say, "There goes another one." He meant me. I mowed down the rubber cones as if they marched at me, an orange army invading from an orange planet. My head snapped with every curb I hit, a speed bag for the fist I never saw. I failed driver's ed. F like father, F like Frank, my father's name. My father now would have to teach me how to drive. He said, "I'd like to mount a cannon on the hood of my car, swivel it around and blast all the bad drivers off the road." He meant me. So I learned to drive, one eye on the quaking of his chin, the cords in his neck, waiting for him to shred my learner's permit so it fluttered in my face. A taxi dropped him off one morning. "You have to drive me back to the city," he said. I lost my car. At the age of 5 or so, I lost my turtle under the bed. My father found the creature, crawling on his fingertips, still trying to escape. JFK was president in 1962, but my father was the finder of lost turtles. I tucked my learner's permit in my shirt pocket and drove him to the city. I read the stubble on his chin. My father, who silenced the room whenever he spoke, said nothing. Years before the AA meeting, when he stood up and said, "Hello, my name is Frank." We drove around the same block 3 times before I said, "There it is. Someone tore the cannon off the hood. That's why we missed it." It's great, right? Yeah. Martine's, Charlie Parker, the musician Bird, said, "If you don't live it, it won't come out of your horn." And I think about that all the time, and Martine is one of those poets who, it comes out of his horn, right? You know, like you can tell that he's been living the stuff. You know, there are some poets who, you know, like, or maybe I don't want to frame it in that way, but if I'm out here spitting on waiters and clubbing seals, I can't summon rigorous empathy in my poems. You know what I'm saying? That's a loose translation of Charlie Parker, I think, and you can tell that Martine, you can tell that he lives it. I'm going to read one more poem, and then I'm going to cede the floor to my betters. This is a poem by Mary Carr, who I think is probably best known as a memoirist, but considers herself a poet, and I really, really love her poetry. This is a poem that I've sent to dozens of newly sober people at various points over my decade and change of sobriety, and it's like practically become as close to scripture as a secular thing, like whatever. This is called Wisdom, the Voice of God, again, by Mary Carr. 90% of what's wrong with you could be cured with a hot bath, says God through the manhole covers. But you want magic to win the lottery you never bought a ticket for. Tenderly, the monks chant, embrace the suffering. The voice never panders, offers no 5-year plan, no long-term solution, no edicts from a cloudy white beard hooked over ears. It is small and fond and local. Don't look for your initials in the geese honking overhead or see through the glass even darkly. It says the most obvious shit, i.e., put down that gun. You need a sandwich. So that's Mary Carr. Yeah, clap for Mary Carr. That's fine. Yeah, you're not clapping for me. Clap for Mary Carr. Yeah. Thanks so much. I appreciate it. I'm gonna invite Paige to come up and read some favorite poems from the anthology, and then we'll have our contributors, Joy and Tomas, come up and read their contributions, and then we'll have, I think, a little bit of time after that to sort of chop it up amongst ourselves, and then you'll all be released. Thanks.
Hello, can you hear me? Good, awesome. Thank y'all for being here. This is exciting. I can't see any of you. Everything is just bright lights and kind of figures in the distance. But I imagine that you're there. I'm going to read a few of my favorite poems from this collection, which means that it's a few favorite of many favorites. It was such a joy to put this collection together, to have a reason to reach out to our favorite poets and be like, I'm going to email you because I would like some poems, and for them to actually respond is so exciting. It has been something, it was really interesting when Kaveh first gave me Last Call, the first anthology. I hadn't really thought about addiction much, even though it was everywhere in my family. I believe, my first memory of time with my dad was him promising to take me to dinner and then actually going to a bar and then driving me home drunk. And that's something that I'd never really thought about and kind of had pushed to the back of my mind, just all of those sorts of experiences, until I started reading poems about addiction, about alcoholism from that anthology. And so it was hugely important and necessary for me to have that collection. And so to then get to be a part of putting that collection, that second sort of collection together with Kaveh, has been incredible. So I'm just going to read a few poems. One is longer and then one is short. The first one I'm going to read is by Sharon Olds, and it's called The Chute, Chute. When I was a kid, my father built a hole down through the center of the house. It started in the upstairs closet, a black square mouth like a well with a lid on it. It plummeted down behind the kitchen wall, and the raw pine cloaca tip of it was down in the basement where the twisted wicker basket lay on the cement floor. So when someone dropped in laundry at the top, it would drop with the speed of sheer falling. In the kitchen, you'd hear that whisk of pure descent behind the wall. And halfway down, there was an electric fixture for the doorbell. That bell my father would ring and ring years later when he stood at the door with that blood on him, like a newborn's call, ringing, ringing to enter. But back then, he was only halfway down, a wad of sheets stuck in the chute. He could still fix the doorbell when it busted. He'd stand his kids in front of him, 3 skinny, scared, braggart kids, and run his gaze over them, a surgeon running his eyes over the tray. And he'd select a kid and take that kid by the ankles and slowly feed that kid down the chute. First, you'd do a handstand on the lip of it, and then he'd lower you in. The smell of pine and dirty laundry, his grip on your ankles like the steel he sold. He'd lower you until your whole body was in it, and you'd find the little wires, red and blue, like a vein and a nerve, and you'd tape them together. We thought it was such an honor to be chosen, and like all honors, it was mostly terror. Not only the blood in your head like a sack of worms in wet soil, but how could you believe he would not let go? He would joke about it, standing there, holding his kid like a bottle brush inside a bottle, or the way they drown people. He'd lower us down as if dipping us into the darkness before birth, and he'd pretend to let go. He loved to hear the passionate screaming in a narrow space. How could you trust him? And then, if you were his, half him, your left hand maybe, and your left foot dipped in the gleaming, murky liquor of his nature, how could you trust yourself? What would it feel like to be on the side of life? How did the good know they were good? Could they look at their hand and see, under the skin, the greenish light? We hung there in the dark, and yet, you know, he never dropped us, or meant to. He only liked to say he would. So although it's a story with some cruelty in it, finally, it's a story of love and release. The way the Father pulls you out of nothing and stands there foolishly grinning. So that was the long one. And the other poem that I would like to read is by the poet Stephen Espada Dawson. And it's called My Brother Stole Every Spoon in the House. So we don't eat soup anymore. We tried. The bone broth fell right through our forks. Our fingers stained the carpets. We all learned to speak 12 languages, but only the words for good morning and hospital. In Old Norse, my mom learns the phrase, "Where are all the fucking spoons?" Brian went outside, whispered swears to the poplars. They bent their necks to hear him. Brian went outside and left forever, took the rest of the silverware. Brian went outside and left 1,000 doodles he drew, every happy animal that wasn't him. We crumbled them like origami roadkill, stomped them under our feet until they became wine between our toes. We're still drinking it now, 10 years later. I don't know how magnets work. If I tied 1,000,000 together, could they pull him here? The cutlery turned, ash in his pockets, that heavy metal in his blood. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Kansas City is it's a rough AWP. You eat a bunch of barbecue and then you like tired and you gotta read poems. Ooh, all right. When not everybody in this anthology, as Kaveh said, is in recovery. Some of them are writing about people in recovery. I'm in recovery, and I'm in recovery because I discovered that there are sober writers. That was really important for me. So this book is incredible to me for that reason. I don't know if I had walked into a room, if I hadn't walked into a room with a bunch of writers that didn't drink, I might not have ever thought that that could be me. So this feels like a project that I'm a part of, not because I'm a writer, but because I'm in sober community, and that's special. So I'm gonna start out with a new poem. I don't know why, because that's scary, but let's see. Okay, this is called Somewhere on an Interstate in Cleveland, 2003. Stairway to Heaven is playing and motherfuckers is loud. Somebody in the backseat yells out, he's headed to the end zone with an entourage. So it must be winter. This memory has black fog around its borders, like moody gardens I visit inside myself. Outside my body, the air is blue and empty. I am a drunk teenager behind the wheel, no license. The interstate's white lines proliferating, dancing across the windshield like lyrics to a sing-along, my father's shotgun furiously playing air drums. Moments before this, he pulled the car over to the median because he'd seen his high school classmate David Greer's imaginary horse Starburst, who wore blue jean bell bottoms and was orange and actually more like a unicorn, galloping next to us. My father and everyone else in the car, and uncle. Maybe the one aunt left is sitting on somebody's lap, but likely just the men and me. I am still following my daddy everywhere, doing what the men do, every last one of which has to pee and is yelling over the music, one uncle's growling vocal cords ruined with pipe smoke, and the twins' cool suggestions, and the moon glowing like an Arctic scorpion in black light, and the white lines scrolling up the screens of my eyes like credits at the end. I'm alone with my fear, which looks out from the interior gardens like a panther. I know by now how upset my father gets when I panic. The biggest part of me still believes the Father knows everything, that he will never put me in danger. Just take off when you're ready, but don't bullshit, he tells me, as we idle on the side of that empty highway. Inside the body, no sound. Outside, Jimmy Page's guitar kicks into oblivion at the 6-minute mark, and I hit the gas. Lady Winter, blowing white clouds behind us, snow ash carried off Lake Erie, reaches the edges of the soundless forest in my subcortex. I cross the line of my own instinct for danger. I learn I like it. My luck starts to spill thinly through the sand glass. Okay, I'm gonna read the 2 poems in the anthology. I don't know, maybe I'll read 3. This poem is called Blue Heart Baby. Thanks for taking it, y'all. You know, when I wrote Horsepower, I wasn't thinking about substance abuse. But now that I read the book, it's like all in there. So before Kaveh took this poem for the anthology, I wasn't thinking of it, which is crazy. You'll see. Okay. Blue Heart Baby. Everyone want to put hands on a piece of your life. Look at it, how it sags in the Eijengrau, like the yellow belly of a bitch heavy with litter. No better than that meddling-ass moon fool as your own breast hanging low between buildings. People hang from the ropes your heart has let down. The chaos of stars fills up the dead air. Tiny blue flames in the eye bone of the young old junkie girl follow you around the floor of your humming days. And have you seen yourself? I think I am weak and without purpose, your father texts you from the kitchen sauced up after he rolls his heavy body over the loaded pistol he laid on your bed. Get used to life. Every piece of advice is one the giver followed to his own bitterness. You roll the heavy body of the car you loot from your failed fiance down the highway, even the wheel wobbling with fury, insist on hanging on. You must make it to each new morning alive. Beyond your silent mouth, what can you use to protect yourself? The deceitful company of crowds will fail you, have you out here with your young body in the cold, a house dress barefoot on some other woman's back porch where no one knows the address. Let it be if this moment is of use to your life. And how long is a moment in time indistinguishable as speed? Peep the ant-sized airplane creeping across the crescent. How to wake up the next day and the next, and not simply after a decade, after 13 blue moons, stretched belly and empty veins, the gas of constellations run out, heart weighted low in the sky, your chances scattered across the dead years. Elegy for Kentucky. I'm from Kentucky. Nowhere to drive night upon night that last summer, but back to the cokey couple I was crashing with in their 26-year habit. On the way there, the same horse always dying at the curve before I turned like a kitschy disco ball onto their street, name I can't recall. There she lay, toppled like a toy figurine, calm but huffing, a laboring machine making steam, though the cold air belonged to June, its grief. A filly, done before becoming a mother, great belly, black and wide as all surrender, and that magnificent face still against the grass, waiting on the end. There she was every time, whispering something to me, a line throbbing, a visible heartbeat I watched in the mirror for hours with my huge horse eyes. I needed to see her, to make sure she was still there. I went the same way each evening, wanting to feel something, to see this once immortal creature get up. Any weak thing was welcome to finish me then, and when he came into the room with bridle and bit on his 26-year high, when he came up on me where I was lying at that curve in my mind, arms and teeth numb, I did not resist. Just a muted yell inside for months before it lit on me like an ancestor. As a child, I followed my grandfather across the street behind our house, Longfield Avenue, backside of the track where the thoroughbreds for that Maze Derby were trapped, bored of what they were bred for, all their royalty within a corral. My hand, a child's offering, was empty when they snorted and drew their worn noses across my palm, yet it was in their nature to remain friendly toward me. My home did not keep its promise after my grandfather died. There was no protection for what I was without him. Lone black filly, finished before becoming. She must have tired of standing there high-headed, waiting for me to ride her out of that war, to call out, "Let's go, we are done here." This last poem is also in Another Last Call, and it's a new poem too, from the new book, new manuscript. In case somebody wants to take it, no. Okay, so I mean we at AWP, so you gotta shoot your shot. This is called Redemption, and it alludes to a film called Killer of Sheep by Charles Burnett. The protagonist, Stan, is laboring in an abattoir to feed his family, probably a product of the Great Migration in Watts, California. Redemption. Across the street, the Atlantic is draining from the harbor. The aquatic pulse of the 12 million going back. A voice washes into the bay. It's my father, the father I once lost, pulling me back from my single mind. Dance with me, he is saying, at the bar beside me. Studying him, I think about the black worker, his grandfather, a sharecropper in Bama, then a factory worker at U.S. Steel in Cleveland, his father on the line at White Motor Company, then later my father, first to think himself a citizen signing up to join the Navy, a specialist of machines. I want to say the most important thing in the room is the jukebox, but it is the sea. The tide starting to come back into his eyes. Dance with me, he pleads, from that place we go to sip brown, slip the blue collar, where 4 hours into the bottle he hears God's voice and I hear his. Now I'm 31 days sober, deciding to lead myself on this path beyond January, a shepherd, not a killer or specialist of killing machines. I study my father beside me at the bar, and I think of Stan and Killer of Sheep. Stan back in Watts stringing up lambs to feed his family, and his daughter at home, dog-faced. Stan, my grandfathers, time travelers in the Great Migration, the peripatetic pulse of the 6 million coming up. Dance with your father, they are commanding me now, and I refuse with my eyes. I want to say the most important thing in the room is the music, but it is the water. Stand chained to the small ship of America's imagination, listing on the restless sea of time. My father listing, drunk on the stool now, blue magic gas leak labor coming out of his eyes, God all around him and the devil right with him, specters tossing him back and forth until suddenly, like that time in church struck with glory when he ran across the pews, he is hopping up, stepping out onto the blue lit floor yelling, I'll dance alone, I'll dance alone. After all, I am an African. Thank you so much. Free Palestine.
Hey, how are y'all doing? Paige, Kaveh, thank you so much for putting together this beautiful and necessary and important and vital thing, and for making space in it for one of my poems. I am not in recovery. However, I am in recovery as the son of an addict. Just as I've been writing around and through my father's addiction for many years now, I also lived around and through his addiction as a kid. He was addicted to heroin for about 21 years. 11 of those, he was with us. And if I had not written this poem that I'm about to read to you, I wouldn't have been able to write the memoir that came after it, in which I explored my obsessive-compulsive disorder and his addiction. Then later on, I reconciled with him. So this poem it's from my second book. It's been a while. It's probably like 8 or 9 years since I've read it in public. So in a way, it's kind of like a coming home, so thank you. Carita Americana. I found regret in a deli case. It was white and shaped like a brick. On the label, a cow from Vermont grazed on forget-me-nots or drank from a pond. I can't remember which, since it was the black splatters, or was it white splotches I was taken with, and the thin legs, and the elegant body shaped like a tank. Although what I remember most is the missing udder, that pink fist of gravity every Holstein swings, whose absence could have been intended because the artist hoped liberating his cows from the bondage of breasts, an act of charity, no doubt, though not Roman, Hindu maybe, would impress the feminist he was dating who was head over heels for vegan babka. The meat cutter offered me a taste because he saw how I kept staring longingly in his case as if I were starving at that blessed cow without nipples, drawn by a lovesick artist in Jersey who wanted me to believe it gave the milk that made the immaculate cheese now sitting in my hand, whose taste I already knew well, even though I played the naif, even though I knew better, that after I had chewed the last bite of that sacred square, in 2 minutes' time, maybe less, I would begin expanding, but not with the Holy Ghost, with lactose in the small intestine. So by the time I reached my car, I'd be ready for the fiddle because I would look like one of the demented Roman emperors, the ones that were all paunch and wild eyes and who had a taste for fire. To the young meat cutter waiting for my answer for 5 o'clock, for an escape from the madness of fluorescent lighting, I wanted to say thou, wanted to be formal, not because it rhymed with cow. It was that magical beast, after all, that joined us, but because we were beyond the quotidian now, and biblical time is archaic, and thus it would only be proper to say, thou slicer, thou priest of the cold cut, who set me on the path of suffering with an act of charity. Do you know your Vermeer, your Caravaggio, and Rubens, and thus the story of Piero and Simone, and how the one, the grown child, fed the other, her jailed father, in secret, with the milk of her body, so that he wouldn't die, as had been decreed from want, from lack of food and drink, and how when all was discovered, the father was released, and the daughter's gift was named Carita Romana. I mumble thou, and then, no thanks, because I'm already late to visit my father in the hospital, in his cold room, which, in another country, one thick with forests and secrets, with caves to hide in from the authorities, would be for enemies of the state. He's a prisoner of his body. His hunger is vulgar, beastly even. But unlike Piero, there is no milk in my chest, which I would let him cleave and suckle anyway, but for the bitterness swimming there. He looks almost Roman now, with his buzzed head and marching veins. For all his brio, he'll never teach another son how to steal corn by moonlight, just enough to eat and sell, or how to build a house, or how to read the soot marks on any brick from the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. When he wakes and adds his lowing baritone to the shrieks and trills of his neighbors down the hall, I clear my throat and do my best cowbird and watch his face cloud with yearning, a naked shyness, like the kind a calf wears when it's startled by your voice and it drops its mother's nipple to stare at you, milk still hot on its tongue. His sweet cow face is almost enough for me to forget the old injuries, how he laughed every time I retched in the bathroom because of the butter he hid in my food. No, I can't lie and tell him what he wants to hear. Will not say that I love him. Will not admit to that. Instead, I'll wash his hair and clip his nails, shave his face, and when my traitorous lip trembles with pity, I'll whistle louder, longer, and teach him about regret. Feed it to him, one note at a time. And though he knows he shouldn't, he'll devour it with the knowledge that my song will swell and split his heart. Thank you.
Can you guys, am I embiggened? Can you hear me? Cool, okay, that's cool, however you guys do that. Yeah, I love poetry so much. It's so cool to hear you guys. I mean, I've spent so much time with these poems, but it's so cool to hear you guys give them life and give them air. Tomas, I've never seen you read in person before, and that was really special. Thank you.
Likewise.
Yeah, well, that was, but yeah, I thank you. That was really, really special. You were, you know, the conceit of getting a poet to read their own work. Like, you're all literate, I assume. Like, any one of you could come up here and read these poems, but the conceit of having the poet read their own work is that you hope that they can bring some of that catalytic energy that brought the poem into the world in the first place into the performance of it. You hope that they can catch one of those stray sparks off the poem, and I feel like you guys did that so beautifully, and I'm getting goosebumps talking about it. It's just such an honor to get to be in your presence for that.
Any chance I have to be catalytic.
So I think I meant to sort of facilitate the movement of free-flowing conversation now, totally organically, but maybe I was thinking about, you know, the title of this anthology, Another Last Call, Poems on Addiction and Deliverance, published by Sarabande Books, says Poems on Addiction and Deliverance, and we've spoken a lot already about addiction, but I wondered if maybe, Paige, we can start with you since you were one of the editorial minds behind this enterprise. Do you want to talk a little bit about what deliverance means as a curatorial principle, and then maybe you guys can talk about what deliverance means in relation to your thinking about this content?
Can you hear me? Oh, nice. No, I don't. Say more.
All right. Well, my beloved spouse,
Well, what are you thinking about when you're thinking?
Well, I think that there is a contingent of people in recovery who believe it to be a spiritual problem that requires a spiritual solution, not necessarily a capital G God who sits on a cloud stroking his beard, but a power larger than one's own ego. But I also think that it can apply to people who love an addict and being delivered from the ravages of loving someone through a disease, or thinking that, you know, you can, you know, your son pawned your TV because you erred in some way in your parenting, and deliverance from that self-flagellation, deliverance from the endless reprocessing of one's own decisions that could have contributed or aided and abetted a disease. I think that there are lots of valences of the word. I think it's a fascinating word. Is that
that's
enough
great.
of
That
a
was great.
springboard?
Yeah, I think just thinking about deliverance in terms of, for me, I think it was really difficult growing up in a family that didn't want to talk about addiction. Like, my mother lost her first husband. He was hit by a drunk driver while he was crossing the street after having an argument with her. And then her second husband stole her car to sell for drugs. And she had to just run away from him. And then her third husband, my father, refused to take his medication because he wouldn't be able to take it while drinking. And she sort of held on to all of that, and thought that this had something to do with her as a person, and she felt a lot of guilt about what that meant for her children, who she had with these men. And so we never talked about it. It was sort of ignored, and she sort of held on to that. And it was something that, like I said before, I really didn't think about the weight of it until I read poems by people also dealing with the weight of it. I remember once going to talk with a group of people who were who had beloveds who were addicts and not in recovery, and in recovery. And I remember one of them bursting out into tears halfway through just talking about something that she had talked about in previous meetings, and it was just like there was this release suddenly, and she was like, I can't actually change this person. Nothing I do like has this effect, and I have to be okay with that.
Yeah.
I have to be okay with this not being on me to change this person. And I felt like that was a very important moment for me, and thinking about like, oh, like I love you. I can only like help in certain ways, and then it's up to you to do the rest, and I can't take that burden on. And I think of deliverance for me in that way of like, oh, I am only going to be able to help myself in these situations.
Yeah, deliverance from that sense of responsibility,
Yeah.
to gaze upon the suffering of an addict and feel no responsibility is a kind of deliverance, I think, especially when that addict is someone that you love or gave birth to or married or, yeah. Can you guys maybe speak about it?
I had a sort of opposite experience where my father's addiction was just common knowledge, and as a kid, like me and my mom were there with him on drug runs and, all of that stuff. We couldn't have friends over because, there's no telling what condition, he'd be in. So it was always, and everyone in town knew it was a small rural town. But what comes to mind when I think about the word deliverance is, if you think about when we're waiting for a package to be delivered to us, right? And if we're lucky, there's a tracking number, right? The other part, the twin of deliverance is expectation, right? The expectation that this thing is coming, right? And I felt like so often, in my experience with my dad as a kid, he'd go to rehab and then he'd get straight for a few days and then he'd break out, literally break out of rehab, and we'd have to go fetch him. And but this idea that his being delivered from his addiction, like the expectation that would happen this time, and then next time, maybe next time, was so enormous.
Yeah.
So enormous. It was like that package that's lost in the mail.
Yeah.
You desperately want what's in there, and you want that connection between the sender and you as the recipient to be completed, right? And again, this all ties into my OCD, right? Like completing that loop, right? Completing that loop. So I think expectation, right? That is such an important part of deliverance.
That's beautiful. I love that. I love the introduction of the word expectation.
Yeah, I'm also thinking about waiting too.
About
Waiting, like expectation, but also waiting on us, deliverance to happen. I grew up in church, and so that word takes on like a religious meaning to me, deliverance, salvation, that kind of a thing. And I also grew up in a black family and in black church, and with ordained people who were also addicts, So it's interesting how I think a kind of not earthly or an unearthly kind of reliance on a deliverance from God rather than what one can do for oneself, but how that can also act as it can act as a thing to lean on, to not have to really make an intervention into one's problems. But, for me, it's hard to separate addiction and alcoholism from socioeconomic circumstances because, I grew up in a family where a lot of people, no one in the family would think about anyone as an alcoholic. My youngest first cousin passed away at the end of 2022, drunk driving. We grew up drinking with our fathers and our uncles and our family members, and no one said anything about the fact that he had drunk 2 bottles of Douce that day on Instagram, Like no one to this day still hasn't said anything about it. It's just that, he wasn't wearing his seatbelt, And so like when you come up in a family like that, you don't really think about substance abuse as a problem you might have. It's just like, this is the kind of people we are. We hard people, we hard drinkers, And that's really hard to kind of deliver yourself out of. So yeah, I don't know. Sometimes, I don't know if any of that, I don't have a neat conclusion to any
No,
of that.
that's beautiful.
But I've been trying to do a lot of work in the writing, like addressing, alcoholism and addiction at the intersection of working classness, at the intersection of blackness. I've been researching a lot, like Frederick Douglass talked about this in his narrative, like, the introduction of alcoholism into the slave community. And so I've been thinking a lot about that.
Yeah, and I mean, toward that end, Tommy Orange's book, There, and also his forthcoming book, Wandering Stars, are, to my mind, great additions to the canon of addiction literature for how they talk about the weaponization of alcohol within indigenous and native communities. Wandering Stars especially, which will be out next month from Knopf. And I think that that's an important part. And maybe you and I can sort of take a beat on this one, because we've both, you alluded to this, so I'm not betraying any confidences. We've both spent a not insignificant amount of time in recovery meetings. And there are fewer people who, there aren't a lot of half Iranians, half Americans who were born there and raised here in the meetings, right? Who are like kind of Muslimish and, just as, the vast majority, especially corporeal meetings, there are such things as BIPOC meetings and queer meetings, but the vast majority of them are middle-aged white dudes, and that's dope. Those are the dudes who got me sober, right? Like I got sober in a room full of people who I think like 85% of them probably thought Obama swore in on the Quran. You know what I mean? And that had its charm to me in its way. Like these people with whom I'd have nothing to talk about outside of the rooms or sort of help. But there are certain valences of the condition, like what you're alluding to, that seem less spoken about, or like there's less support for that. Do you want to share, I don't know, do you want to share anything about how you found that in recovery or in the writing even?
I think in an opposite way, well, first of all, the person who brought me into the rooms was the homie who's around the same age as me, a poet, Black, who just walked out of the room, but and also in the anthology. I won't say his name.
Oh, I didn't know I wasn't supposed to say his name. I'm
But
sorry.
but honestly, the meetings had the opposite effect for me, because I walked in and it was like, I went through early racial trauma, separated from my father by my mother's family, and so on and so forth. But it was really life-changing to actually go into these meetings and see and listen to older white men telling the truth and telling on themselves and being so honest.
Yeah.
Which is something I don't see like largely collectively as like, a certain demographic of America. I'm thinking about like when January 6th happened and they were interviewing people afterwards that they caught on camera and they were like, no, I didn't do it, it wasn't me, this kind of lack of accountability and honesty. And that was transformative for me. I was like, damn, white people being here telling the truth on themselves. And that was the charm for me in the beginning.
I honestly never thought about that, but that's totally true.
It related to the writing for me, because it's like, for so long I thought like, getting high was like how I access creativity and a certain kind of rapture to get into the work, what led me into spirituality in a way. But really it's the ability, it's like having nothing between you and yourself. And that requires like just utter honesty. So like going in the meeting, like, and seeing that from others and then like practicing that, I think is like actually exactly what I needed as a writer.
That's beautiful. I love nothing between you and yourself. That's good. Yeah, I was talking to a group of high schoolers in Michigan yesterday, and one of them was like, but what about people who use, they were very interested in the fact that I was in recovery. And they were like, what about people who use hallucinogens or use substances to sort of transcend and be able to write from that place? And I think that's a really common thought, right? You know, I think that, I mean, I certainly know a lot of writers who believe that they need to be a little tipsy in order to write, you know, or, you know, who rely on that looseness. And I do think that it is true that great art has often been made historically by people who perceive themselves to be on the outside looking in, whether that be, you know, psychopathologically or socioeconomically or racially or ethically, religiously, or narcotically, right? But I think that that's a craft thing, right? Like if you're sat at a table eating a turkey leg and drinking from your golden goblet and, you know, in front of a roaring fire, it feels altogether fitting and proper that you should have your turkey leg and your golden goblet and your roaring fire, right? But if you're sat on the outside, you know, getting rained on and hungry with your nose pressed to the glass, it seems awfully strange that that person in there should have a turkey leg and a golden goblet and a roaring fire while you're so miserable, right? And so it's like when you're inside the cloud, it's hard to describe the cloud, but when you're on the ground, you can be like, that's a rhino and that's a clown and that's a giraffe, right? This tracks, right? You guys, okay, great. And so there's that sort of like synapse which becomes a defamiliarist potential, and it is undeniably true that alcohol or booze or whatever, or drugs or whatever, can provide that kind of remove from a station to which you might otherwise feel habituated. But it takes 0 seconds for you to become habituated to that drunk station then, or to that high station, right? Whereas like, you know, those of you who have children, you know, if you take a 3-year-old to a playground and they stick a rock in their mouth, you're like, why would you do that? Like, that's not food. And then you're like, wait a minute, rocks are basically like food shaped and food colored. Like, why wouldn't, like, of course, why wouldn't I put that in my mouth and think to eat it, right? That's also a defamiliarist potential, like observing children or observing, you know what I mean? Like, there are so many cleaner fuels to my mind, right? I'm not saying that, I don't know, what do you think about all this? Like, I mean, in terms of, you know, are you familiar with people being like, I have to be high in order to write? Or
Well, there's like the Hemingway, like, write drunk, edit sober.
Yeah.
And I've heard men often be like, yeah, that's the way to do it.
Yeah.
And I feel like just going to a lot of writing classes, that is kind of like half of the writers are acting in that way.
Yeah,
Just
we
writing
had a professor who shall remain nameless who would have their workshops at their house with an open bar and open weed being passed around, and I was like in relatively new recovery, and I was like, well, this isn't optimal, you know, for me.
Yeah, well, and I had
On the other hand, someone like James, it made me think of like James Baldwin, who was a heavy drinker, but he wouldn't drink while writing. That was his thing.
So, but until his later work, and then there was, and then you can hear there's a, someone in the audience will know, there was a famous critic who said you could hear the ice clinking in his glass in his later work, you know what I mean? Like, because he really sort of fell into the deep end. But yeah, you know, early on, I think before it reached its zenith.
One of the really significant pieces of early sobriety for me was I stumbled across Leslie Jamison's essay. It's in the New York Times Magazine or New York Style Magazine, where she writes about all, like, you know, the 20th century white male American writers, Iowa writers that were drunks, and how all of their like super drunk projects were celebrated in a kind of sensational way around their alcoholism, but the things that they wrote afterwards weren't, and they were kind of like put down as like not as good because they're not drinking. She kind of like actually, you know, inverts that and like in a kind of like literary critical way reads the later works that were written sober, and that, I don't know, if anybody needs something like that, that's a great essay to read. It's on her website.
It's also
But that was crucial.
I think she adapted it for The Recovering too. Which
The
is-
Recovering.
Yeah.
Which then I read after that.
Yeah, which is like practically like canonical recovery literature now. But that is such a thing, and I remember talking to Jean Valentine about who was of the same generation as Plath and Sexton, and she would talk about how when she was a poet back then, you know, her peers kept killing themselves, and she was talking to her then therapist about it, and she was like, I mean, maybe poetry is killing these people. And her therapist, no, for real, like maybe like spending all of this time, you know, and her therapist wisely, I think, was like, or maybe it kept them longer than they would have been able to stay otherwise, right? And that's how I always feel about writers like Berryman or Baldwin, or, you know, is like they, you know, it's a dirty fuel, but it can help you until it stops working, you know, and Berryman has a novel, an unfinished novel called The Recovery, which is like a manual about how not to do recovery. It's very anthropological, like he's Jane Goodall in rehab, like watching all of the, you know, it's like, it's a really great book about how recovery doesn't work. Tomas, did you want to, I don't mean to skip over, do you want to say anything about the myth of the drunk writer or the reality of the drunk writer?
I don't know. I mean, I feel like, you know, what you were saying earlier about, you know, defamiliarization, and to me, the world, like this could be a product of the obsessive compulsive disorder. It's always felt so strange.
Yeah.
Without being under the influence of anything.
Yeah.
It just, I mean, just everything, like the shapes of those walls. Like
I know.
This room is full of such bizarre things, you know, that I don't need anything to make it stranger.
Yeah.
So, so like when I sit down to write, it's a way of sort of pushing the strangeness out so that it can then come through the page.
Yeah.
You know, yeah.
Can you talk about retaining that permeability to bewilderment, you know, in a world that sort of conspires against it and wants to sort of cudgel you into not thinking critically about it and wants to sort of just familiarize you to both the beauty of the world so that it can sort of frack it without your protest, or and also so it can familiarize you to the various and sundry violences of empire so that it can carry them out without you complaining about it too much? Royal you, not Tomas.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, first, there's a lot in that question.
I know, I'm sorry.
No.
I really can't, I love hearing your brain do things.
Yeah, no, I mean, when I think about it, I think back to what came to mind while you were talking was this thing that my friend, the novelist Fernando Flores, said when he was writing his novel Tears of the Truffle Pig, which is incredible if you haven't read it. He set out to try to write the most unpublishable novel he could, because he just wanted to write something absolutely just banana cakes, you know. And what did he end up doing? He ended up writing a fabulous novel that tons of people have loved and found a great home at MCD Books. And I love the sort of like irreverence that went in that. Like, I'm not going to try to catch some sort of PR wave that's happening right now. And I wonder sometimes if part of, you know, to go back to what you were saying about empire, if part of the sort of agent for him to be able to do that is the fact that he did it on a typewriter, like an actual, not even an electric typewriter, which is like a typewriter. And he's one of these dudes who really keeps it analog, you know. And I mean, I can totally relate to that. I've thought recently, you know, I should get a landline. You know, I don't know if anyone else can relate. I'm like, I don't know that I like being reachable all the time.
Yeah.
You know, again, that's another thing that it kind of, I don't know, it's estranging.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
to always be connected.
Yeah.
I don't know if that
No,
answers
totally,
anything.
totally. And to have the same machine on which you make art also be where all of your friends live. And,
Right,
and
right.
where your job lives and where, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, do I live on the thing? Right. Therefore, it's
Yeah.
like, yeah.
Yeah.
I was just going to say really quickly, I know we're almost out of time, that funnily enough, like in sobriety, I've gotten into surrealism.
Yeah.
And I think this is really important because kind of what y'all are kind of definitively describing, like what we're doing as, supposed to be doing as poets, defamiliarizing, and I also think about how Eduardo talks about displacement. But interestingly enough, the French surrealists, like getting high and like those sort of things, that was like part of the exercise. But then the black surrealists that kind of cannibalized surrealism, like Aimé Césaire, and the Caribbean and Latin American writers, it was more about their condition in the world as a bizarre and bewildering condition, that there was enough material in as a person, as a subject living in Western reality, to access the bizarre anyways.
Yeah.
The world is bizarre as fuck right now. Like,
Yeah. I mean, there's so many things that you wouldn't be able to put in fiction because they'd be too thumb on the scale. Like the anarchist punk princess who marries the tech billionaire is like a literal. They keep having kids. With like Grimes and Musk. That's a thing, right? They're still together?
I don't know. I don't think so.
Doesn't matter. But yeah. And I also think about how there's the famous critique of American poetry surrealism, that when we took it from the Europeans and the great sort of like African surrealists, we sort of flayed the political element from it, and it was just sort of like, whoa, the moon is a cow, without any, without the sort of political valence that was there in the Central and Latin American surrealist tradition too. And it's an interesting thing to sort of hear about to hear contemporary authors returning that to it too.
it's the time. I mean,
Yeah. I mean, like, this is maybe sort of tangential, but I'm going to try to land this plane. When you hear a number like 11,500 children killed in Gaza thus far, that number is so, like, it lands in my mind as this pulverizingly large number. But if it was 11,502 or 11,498, my mind wouldn't be able to really access a qualitative difference in that, right? But when you make art, especially narrative art, as many of the poems in this book are, suddenly you can see one experience with granularity, right? Like we see your father with granularity in that poem. We see one individual experience, right? When you hear one individual narrative, you can lay that over the granularity of individual narrative over the abstraction of a collective grief, right? And suddenly it actualizes it, right? When you hear an individual account, whether it's a poem from Asab or from Rafat, or when you hear an individual account, suddenly there's individuality, and you lay that over the other 11,499, right? And you're like, oh my God, like that gives you some sense of the magnitude. It gives some qualitative aspect to the quantitative data, right? This is the promise of narrative art, right? You step into an individual, unprecedented experience, and then that becomes extrapolatable. That's what we're doing in this anthology, right? Like you step into the experience of you listening to Jimmy Page, or Led Zeppelin or whatever, and suddenly we see one singular, unprecedented experience of how addiction affects the world around it, right? And then you extrapolate that outwards to see, the entirety of. Is this making sense? You guys picking up what I'm putting down?
the violence of abstraction is, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a ethical failure that my mind can't apprehend qualitatively the difference between two when the number is that large, but it is an ethical crisis, right? And I think that art, poetry, fiction, is really one of the most powerful technologies for resolving that particular ethical crisis. There are other ways to come at it. I think we finish at 15 after.
No.
Is that right?
3.
Oh, no, just at 3? Oh, amazing. I think we're done. Thank you all so much. Thank you all so much. I appreciate you.
Thank you.